Don't come alone. Bring your sons, the contractor said after working on my late wife's office. 1 year after my wife, Eleanor, passed away, I finally gathered the courage to renovate her private sanctuary, the second-floor office where she spent 40 years of her life. I had just stepped into the quiet sanctity of our local church when my phone vibrated with a persistence that felt like an alarm. It was the contractor. If you're listening to this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. His voice wasn't just professional. It was brittle, cracking under the weight of something he couldn't comprehend. "Sir, I need you to come see what we discovered," he whispered, "but don't come alone. Bring your 2 sons with you." My heart almost stopped beating in that pew. Why would a man who tears down walls for a living sound so terrified of a room? When my sons and I finally arrived, we found more than just wood and plaster. We found a hidden chamber containing evidence my wife had been meticulously gathering for a quarter of a century. And then the message arrived. It was time for the silence to end. Before I tell you the rest of this haunting discovery, please comment below and let me know what country you're watching from. I want to know how far this husband's revelation has traveled. Now, let me tell you what happened when my sons and I stepped through that secret door. The Sunday morning light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of my home study, casting long, amber shadows across the mahogany desk where Eleanor used to leave me handwritten notes. At 66 years old, I had grown painfully accustomed to the silence of this house. It was a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet. It had been exactly 1 year since the funeral, yet her reading glasses still rested on the side table, and her favorite ceramic mug sat unwashed in the kitchen sink. I was a man frozen in time, unable to move a single relic of our life together. The shrill, electronic ring of my cell phone shattered the stillness. The caller ID displayed a local number I recognized: Marcus Thorne, the contractor I'd hired 3 weeks ago to begin the long-overdue renovation of Eleanor's second-floor office. For decades, Eleanor had worked up there behind a closed door, managing what she called nonprofit grant applications. She was the pillar of our community, a woman of tireless charity. I had never questioned her. "Mr. Sterling." Marcus's voice came through, tight and breathless. This wasn't the easygoing, gravelly drawl of a man who had spent 35 years in the construction business. This was the voice of a man who had seen a ghost. "Marcus, is everything all right? I didn't think you'd be on site on a Sunday," I said, my grip tightening on the arm of my chair. "Sir, I need you to come down here, to your wife's office, right now." There was a pause, heavy with a tension I couldn't name. "And Mr. Sterling, bring your sons. Both of them. Whatever you do, do not come alone." The line went dead before I could ask a single question. I stared at the blank screen of my phone, my mind spinning into a dark abyss. In 40 years of marriage, Eleanor had been the steady one, the navigator who steered our family through every storm with calm grace. I was the one who fumbled, the one who relied on her strength. Now, alone in our sprawling estate in the heart of Asheville, surrounded by her lingering scent of jasmine and old paper, I felt utterly unmoored. I scrolled through my contacts with trembling fingers. First, I called Julian, my eldest. Then Leo. I hadn't seen the two of them in the same room for months. Not since we had sat in the lawyer's office, bickering over the estate. The boys had never been close. They were like 2 different species from the same nest. Julian was the careful corporate lawyer, a man of iron shirts and calculated risks. Leo was the wildfire, a restless soul who had been through 2 divorces and 3 different careers by the age of 36. "Bring your sons, both of them. Don't come alone." The contractor's warning echoed in my skull. Marcus Thorne had worked on some of the oldest, most dilapidated mansions in North Carolina. He'd seen rotted foundations and hidden mold that would make most men gag. What could possibly rattle a man like that to the point of breakdown? And why did he think I needed my sons for protection? By the time Julian's silver luxury sedan pulled into my gravel driveway at 11:15, I had already paced a visible path into the Persian rug. He stepped out, his phone already pressed to his ear, looking every bit the man who valued order above all else. Leo's rugged truck roared up 10 minutes later, music blaring a defiance that felt out of place on a Sunday morning. I met them at the door, my face pale. Inside, both of you. Now, the living room felt cramped with the three sterling men standing in it. Neither of my sons sat down. They stood on opposite sides of the fireplace, maintaining the cold, careful distance they had perfected since childhood. I received a call from Marcus Thorne. I began, my voice sounding thin and old. The contractor working on your mother's suite. He told me we had to go there immediately. He sounded terrified. He insisted I bring you both. The silence that followed was suffocating. That makes no sense, Dad, Leo said, his jaw tight. Did he say there was an accident? A fire? No, I whispered. He said I shouldn't come alone. He wouldn't explain why. Julian's analytical mind was already at work, his eyes narrowing. Mom's office? What could a construction crew find in a home office that requires three grown men for a site visit? He stopped, his gaze shifting to me. Dad, have you spoken to Clara lately? The name of my stepdaughter, Eleanor's child from her first marriage, hung in the air like a sudden chill. Clara had been living in Boston for years, but since the funeral, she had become a ghost. She's been unreachable, Leo offered. I tried her 4 days ago. No return text. It's been 7 days for me, I corrected quietly. She hasn't answered my calls in a week. Julian checked his watch, a nervous habit. Maybe we should wait. Call the police? If Marcus found something dangerous, Dash. No, I said, reaching for my keys with a sudden, uncharacteristic surge of resolve. Marcus said to come now. Whatever Eleanor was hiding in that room, we aren't waiting another hour. We go together. We piled in my heavy black SUV, 3 men packed into seats like we were on one of those awkward family road trips from their childhood. Back then, Clara would sit between them, acting as the diplomat, the bridge between two brothers who didn't know how to speak to one another. Now, the silence was an entity of its own. The drive to the downtown office building where Eleanor kept her primary workspace took only 15 minutes, but it felt like a voyage across an ocean. We drove past the quiet Sunday crowds, people coming out of brunch, laughing and holding hands. I felt like I was watching a world I no longer belonged to. I kept both hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. In my mind, I could hear Eleanor's voice, the way she used to soothe me during my bouts of anxiety. Stay calm, Arthur. Think clearly. Don't let the fear make your decisions for you. But she wasn't here to guide me. And for the first time in 40 years, I began to wonder if I had ever really known the woman who shared my bed. When we turned the corner, I saw Marcus Thorne's work truck parked haphazardly on the curb. Marcus himself was pacing near the heavy glass entrance, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He looked like a man waiting to confess a crime. Leo leaned forward from the back seat. Dad, look at his face. Something is seriously wrong. I pulled into a parking spot and killed the engine. Through the windshield, Marcus saw us. He didn't wave. He didn't move. He just stared at the car, waiting for the three of us to emerge and face whatever was waiting on the second floor. I don't know what we're about to see, I said, looking at my sons in the rearview mirror. But I'm glad you're both here. Marcus didn't offer a handshake when we approached. He just nodded toward the door, his eyes bloodshot. Second floor, the back suite. I think you need to see this for yourselves. I haven't touched anything. I couldn't stay in there alone. The elevator ride was an eternity of mechanical hums and heavy breathing. Leo was restless, shifting his weight. Julian was a statue, his lawyer's mask firmly in place. I watched the floor numbers light up 1, then 2 and wondered what secret my wife had taken to her grave. Eleanor, the woman of grant applications and fundraising. Eleanor, the saint of Asheville. The office door stood wide open. Inside, the space looked exactly as I remembered it. The scent of her jasmine perfume, the neat piles of folders, the antique globe. But the back wall, the one covered by the massive oak bookshelf I had gifted her on our 20th anniversary, had been moved. The bookshelf sat at an unnatural angle, pulled away from the studs to reveal a dark, impossible void in the architecture of the building. I was checking the load-bearing wall for moisture. Marcus said, his voice trembling. Found a hollow pocket. Then I realized the entire bookshelf is on an industrial pivot hinge. It's a custom-built mechanism. It's been here for years. Leo stepped forward, his eyes wide. A hidden room? In Mom's office? You gotta be kidding me. Marcus reached out and pulled a specific leather-bound volume on the middle shelf, a collection of poetry Eleanor had always cherished. There was a heavy, metallic thud from behind the wall. The bookshelf swung inward with the silent, well-oiled precision of a vault. Marcus flipped a switch just inside the door. Fluorescent lights buzzed to life, flickering for a moment before illuminating a room that shouldn't have existed. My breath caught. My knees felt weak. The room was roughly 10 by 12 feet, windowless and climate-controlled. Lining the walls were 15 steel filing cabinets, each drawer labeled in Eleanor's elegant, perfect cursive. In the corner sat a bank of monitors and an old VHS player. And in the center of the room sat Eleanor's leather chair, the one she had claimed was lost in a move 10 years ago. It wasn't a hidden office. It was a command center. My God, Julian whispered, stepping into the room. Look at the labels. I stood in the doorway, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I stared at my wife's handwriting, the same handwriting that had written our children's birth announcements in my 65th birthday card. One label caught my eye. Mayor Vance, 2005 to 2020. My hand trembled as I reached out to touch the cold metal of the drawer. Mayor Vance was a family friend. We had dinner with him once a month. Dad, Julian's voice was sharp, cracking with a fear I'd never heard from him. He had opened a drawer in the second cabinet and pulled out a thick, bulging folder. Photographs spilled onto the floor, surveillance photos of men in dark alleys, bank statements with seven-figure transfers, and a ledger in Eleanor's hand. Julian looked up, his face completely drained of color. These aren't grant applications, Dad. These are blackmail files, totaling millions of dollars. For the next 90 minutes, the three of us worked in a state of clinical shock. The air in that windowless room felt thin, as if the secrets stored that were consuming all the oxygen. We moved like ghosts, pulling drawer after drawer, trying to map out the terrifying geography of Eleanor's hidden life. Julian, true to his legal training, approached the chaos with a grim, systematic focus. He found a master ledger bound in deep blue leather in the center cabinet. Every page was a testament to Eleanor's obsession. It was a record of lives held in the palm of her hand. 47 people, Julian said, his voice echoing flatly against the steel cabinets. The entries go back 25 years. She wasn't just collecting information, she was running an audit on the city's elite. Leo was on the other side of the room, his hands shaking as he held a file labeled Biotech Global, 2015 to 2024. Inside were high-resolution photographs of a corporate executive meeting a man in a rain-slicked parking garage. There were photocopied bank transfers to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Singapore. This one alone, Leo whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and disgust. A monthly consulting fee of $10,000. For 9 years. That's over $1 million just to keep her mouth shut about Medicare fraud. I couldn't bring myself to touch the files yet. I stood near the television monitors, staring at a security hub mounted on the wall. For camera angles displayed the room we were currently standing in, plus the hallway outside and the main office. Eleanor had been watching this space 24 hours a day. Even when we were at home, sitting on the porch with our evening tea, she could have glanced at her phone and seen exactly who was walking past her secret door. Julian flipped through the master ledger faster, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. She categorized them by the nature of their sins, Dad. Corruption, fraud, narcotics trafficking, even assault. She didn't just find these things by accident. She hunted them. Look at this, Leo said, pointing to a file marked Judge Sterling Hardy. Inside was a photo of a prominent local judge accepting a briefcase in a courthouse restroom. Beneath it was a meticulous list of court cases he had adjusted in exchange for Eleanor's silence. She had the judiciary, the mayor's office, and the medical boards all paying into her accounts. How much, Julian? I asked, finally finding my voice. It sounded like it belonged to a stranger. How much money is in those ledgers? Julian's eyes scanned a final spreadsheet. According to her own balance sheets, The total collected over 25 years is approximately $15 million. There's a current trust balance of $8,400,000. She spent nearly $7 million, Leo noted, his eyes darting around the room. On what? We live comfortably, but we don't live like $15 million extortionists. I moved toward the leather chair, my wife's chair. On the small side table lay a slim, hand-sewn journal. I opened it, expecting more bank codes. Instead, I found her heart. It wasn't evidence. It was a diary of her double life. March 3rd, 2019, I read aloud. Mayor Vance's payment is late again. I had to remind him of the consequences. The pressure is increasing, but I must protect what matters most. Everything for Arthur. Everything for the boys. January 5th, 2024, the next entry read. Someone is asking questions at the bank. I need to secure the final insurance. If they find out who he is, it all ends. My hands trembled so violently the journal nearly fell. Who he is? I whispered. Is she talking about me? The room felt like it was spinning. This wasn't a lapse in judgment or a temporary fall from grace. This was an empire built with the same meticulous care she had used to raise our sons and tend to our garden. The woman who had reminded me to take my heart medication every morning at 8 o'clock sharp had been presiding over a criminal enterprise that would make a mob boss blush. I was married to her for 4 decades. I choked out, looking at my sons. How could I not have known? How could I have slept beside her while she was monitoring blackmail payments on her phone? Neither of them could look me in the eye. The betrayal was a physical weight pressing down on all of us. Dad, Leo said, his voice taking on a sudden urgency. He was crouching behind the television cart. I found something else, tucked behind the DVR. He held up a VHS tape in a clear plastic case. There was a strip of white masking tape across the front with 3 words written in Eleanor's unmistakably elegant hand. For Arthur. Watch first. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Put in, I said. Julian cleared a space on the desk, his movements jerky and panicked. Leo fed the tape into the player. The machine groaned, a mechanical whirring that seemed to fill the entire building. Static flickered across the screen, snowy, gray, and chaotic, and then, suddenly, the image resolved. There she was. Eleanor. My Eleanor. She was sitting in the very chair I was now touching, her face framed by the filing cabinets. The date stamp in the bottom corner read, March 6th, 2024. This was filmed just 14 days before the car accident, just 2 weeks before she died. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of makeup could hide, and her hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was pulled back in a messy, hurried bun. But her eyes, those sharp, piercing blue eyes, were focused directly on the lens with an intensity that felt like she was reaching out from the grave to grab me by the throat. Arthur, her voice filled the room. It was warm, melodic, and terrifyingly familiar. If you're watching this, it means I am gone. And it means someone close to our family is responsible for my departure. Leo swore under his breath. Julian went completely rigid, his breath hitching. I need you to understand one thing, Arthur. Eleanor continued, her words slow and deliberate. Everything in this room, every file, every dollar, every secret I held over these people, it wasn't about greed. I never spent a penny of that money on myself. It was all for protection. She leaned closer to the camera, her expression softening for a fleeting second before turning back to steel. Every dollar I collected has been placed into a secure trust for our grandchildren, for Olivia and Leo's boys. It's for their future, for their safety. I wanted to scream at the screen. I wanted to ask her why she didn't just talk to me. But the ghost of my wife kept speaking. The person who will kill me, she said, her voice cracking for the first time, is someone you trust completely. Someone who has sat at our dinner table. Someone who has been in our home, celebrating holidays with us. She paused, looking off camera as if she heard a noise in the hallway. When she turned back, there was a raw, naked fear in her eyes. I cannot name them on this tape. It's too dangerous for you if the tape is found by the wrong hands. But I have left everything you need in the subsequent recordings. You must watch them in order. Do not skip ahead. She took a deep breath, composed herself, and pointed a finger toward the camera. Trust Julian and Leo. They're good men, Arthur. You raised them well. But you must be very, very careful who else you tell about this room. Especially, she paused again, the silence on the tape stretching for 5 agonizing seconds. Especially your daughters-in-law. The screen abruptly dissolved back into static. The mechanical click of the VHS player reaching the end of the tape sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I stared at the black screen, my wife's final warning echoing in the chamber. Daughters-in-law, Julian whispered, his face ashen. She said, we can't trust Angela. Leo turned to look at his brother, and for the first time in years, the distance between them wasn't caused by old grudges. It was caused by a new, poisonous current of suspicion. Before we could speak, the sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel outside reached our ears. I moved to the small window in the outer office and peered down. 3 black SUVs had pulled up to the curb, their tinted windows reflecting the harsh afternoon sun. The doors opened in unison, and men in dark suits stepped out with a clinical, military precision. "Dad," Julian said, standing behind me. "We have company." I felt a cold shiver race down my spine. Eleanor had said someone we trusted was coming for her. I realized then that finding the room wasn't the end of the mystery. It was the beginning of a hunt. "Whatever happens," I said, turning to my sons, "we don't tell them about the tapes." Not yet. As the heavy footsteps sounded in the stairwell, I realized my life as Arthur Sterling, the quiet widower of Asheville, was over. I was a man standing in a fortress of secrets, and the walls were starting to close in. The heavy glass doors of the office suite downstairs didn't just open. They were breached with the practiced authority of people who owned the building and everyone inside it. That sound, the sharp, metallic percussion of a lock being force sent a jolt of primal adrenaline through my 66-year-old frame. My sons and I stood frozen in the center of Eleanor's secret vault, our breathing shallow, as the heavy tread of boots echoed up the stairwell. It wasn't the tentative step of a curious contractor or a wandering security guard. This was a rhythmic, tactical advance. I instinctively stepped in front of the VHS player, shielding the tape with my body as if my flesh could protect the fragile, magnetic strip containing Eleanor's final words. Julian's legal mask snapped back into place, his jaw set in a hard line that mimicked the granite facade of a courthouse, while Leo's hands balled into fists at his sides, his shoulders hunching like a brawler ready for a fight. The men who entered the office weren't local police. There were no tan uniforms or jingling utility belts. These men wore the dark, tailored suits of federal authority garments designed to be anonymous yet intimidating. A man in his mid-50s led the way. He was broad-shouldered and moved with a terrifying economy of motion. His eyes were the most striking feature. They were a weathered gray, looking like they had spent decades staring into every dark corner of human depravity. Behind him was a younger woman with sharp, assessing features and hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked painful. She carried a high-end tablet like a weapon, her thumbs poised over the screen. "Mr. Sterling," the man said. His voice was a low, rhythmic rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small, windowless room. He held up a leather badge case, the gold eagle of the United States Marshals Service catching the fluorescent light. "I am United States Marshal Elias Vance, and this is Special Agent Sarah Miller from the FBI. We've been waiting for you to find this room." My living room at home had always felt spacious, a place of comfort and Sunday afternoon naps. But here, surrounded by the cold steel archives of my wife's double life, the presence of 5 federal agents made the air feel thin, almost unbreathable. "Waiting for us." Julian stepped forward, his voice dripping with the professional skepticism he usually reserved for hostile witnesses. "You've been monitoring my mother's private property? On what legal grounds? You're standing in a private residence's extension without a warrant, as far as I can see." Marshal Vance didn't flinch at the lawyerly posturing. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the filing cabinets, before settling into a chair near Eleanor's desk with a weary sigh. We've been monitoring Eleanor's consulting operation for over 6 months, counselor. Ever since one of her high-profile targets in Charlotte, a man who thought he was untouchable, suffered a complete nervous breakdown and tried to trade Eleanor's name for a reduced sentence and federal immunity. My stomach dropped into a cold, hollow pit. The jasmine scent of the room suddenly felt like the smell of a funeral parlor. "You knew," I whispered. The realization was a slow-acting poison. "You knew she was doing this? You let her walk into this office every day, knowing she was playing with fire. We knew she was collecting massive payments from 47 distinct individuals across the Southeast," Agent Miller said, her thumbs dancing across her tablet screen. "But as we dug deeper into the shell companies and the offshore routings, we realized this wasn't a standard extortion racket. Eleanor wasn't buying jewelry, she wasn't buying designer clothes, and she certainly wasn't buying sports cars. She was building a war chest." She turned the tablet toward us, displaying a complex web of flowcharts that looked like a map of a digital nervous system. She was documenting a shadow network of corruption, money laundering, and racketeering that stretches back 40 years. Many of the names in these files, names you probably recognize from the local news, are connected to the very foundations of organized crime in Virginia and North Carolina. "So you used her," Leo spat, his face flushing with a hot, righteous anger. "You sat back in your air-conditioned offices and let her keep playing this dangerous game, just so you could build your case? You used my mother as bait." "Eleanor was an unofficial cooperator," Vance said gravely, his eyes never leaving mine. "She reached out to us 4 months ago. She was terrified, Leo. She knew she had reached the end of the line. She agreed to turn over her entire archive, everything in these cabinets, on the condition of total immunity for her family and a very specific high-level protection detail for her husband. But she died before the formal handoff could happen." "It was an accident," I said, though my voice lacked even a shred of conviction. I thought of the Blue Ridge Parkway, the fog, the twisted metal. "The police report, it said the brakes failed. It was a mechanical malfunction." "The brakes were sabotaged, Mr. Sterling," Miller said bluntly, her voice devoid of any comforting platitude. "Our forensic mechanics from the Quantico lab examined the wreckage in a secure hangar. The lines weren't worn. They weren't leaking. They were severed with a professional-grade thermal cutter. Your wife didn't lose control of her car. Eleanor was murdered." The word "murdered" hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. I felt the strength leave my legs, and I sank into Eleanor's leather chair, the command post of her secret empire. I ran my hands over the armrests, feeling the ghosts of 40 years pressing against me. She had sat here in this very spot, knowing she was being hunted. "Which brings us to the most urgent matter," Vance said, leaning forward until he was in my personal space. 4 days ago, your stepdaughter, Clara, walked into a branch of the First National Bank in Boston. Using a perfectly legitimate power of attorney, she withdrew $4,700,000 from one of Eleanor's trust accounts. She wired the funds to a private bank in the Cayman Islands and vanished. "Clara wouldn't do that," I protested, my voice cracking. "She's a teacher. She's Eleanor's daughter. She wouldn't steal from the estate." But even as the words left my mouth, the memory of her week-long silence curdled in my gut. Her phone was deactivated at the Charlotte Douglas Airport 6 hours after the transfer, Miller added, her tone clinical. "No credit card activity, no travel bookings under her name. Either she's running for her life with the money Eleanor intended for your protection, or the people Eleanor was investigating have her and used her to drain the accounts." My mind was a kaleidoscope of horror. Clara missing. Eleanor murdered. Federal agents talking about organized crime as if it were a local PDA meeting. Just 4 hours ago, I was a grieving widower worried about a renovation. Now, the floor was falling out from under me, and I was tumbling into a world I didn't recognize. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The vibration felt like an electric shock against my hip. I pulled it out with trembling fingers. It was an unknown number, no caller ID. A single text message glowed on the screen in the dim light of the hidden room. "She knew too much. You do too. Stop looking or the boys are next." I didn't say a word. I simply turned the screen around and held the phone out for Vance to see. His jaw tightened until I thought I could hear his teeth grinding. He took the phone from my hand and passed it to Miller, who immediately began a trace that I knew would lead to a dead-end burner phone. "They know you found the room," Vance said, his voice dropping an octave. "Mr. Sterling, the window for debate has closed. I'm recommending an immediate emergency relocation. We have a federal safe house ready in Tennessee. You, your sons, their wives, and the grandchildren. We move tonight. We leave everything behind. Tonight." Julian's voice cracked. "I have a hearing tomorrow. My kids. Angela will lose her mind if I tell her we have to disappear into the night because of some secret room we found in the wall." "Your wife will lose her life if you don't," Miller said. She wasn't being mean. She was being honest. "These people don't leave witnesses, Julian. They don't leave loose ends." Julian was already on his phone, pacing the outer office. Through the glass partition, I could see his face turn a sickly shade of pale as he spoke to Angela. He hung up and walked back in, looking defeated. "She thinks I'm having a nervous breakdown. She says she won't uproot the kids and put them in a government van over a contractor's discovery. She's refusing to leave the house." I thought about Eleanor's tape. I thought about the exhaustion in her eyes and that haunting final warning. "Especially your daughters-in-law. Was she warning me about their safety or something else?" "No safe house," I said suddenly. The words felt heavy, like stones being dropped into a deep well. The room went silent. Vance and Miller both turned to me, their expressions unreadable. Even my sons looked at me as if I had lost my mind. "Dad, what are you saying?" Leo asked, stepping toward me. "They just told us Mom was murdered. We have to go." "Eleanor didn't run," I said, and for the first time in a year, I felt a spark of something other than grief. She spent 25 years standing her ground in this very room, building a wall of secrets to protect us. If we run now, whoever killed her wins. They get the money, they keep their secrets, and we spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, waiting for a brake line to be cut or a house to be burned. "I'm done running. Mr. Sterling, you are in no position to fight a criminal syndicate," Vance warned, his hand resting near his sidearm. "I have her files," I countered, gesturing to the 15 cabinets that held the lives of 47 powerful men in their steel drawers. "I have her evidence. And I have you. We stay in a house. We use 24/7 protection, but we don't hide. We finish what she started. We find out who killed her." A long, agonizing silence followed. Vance looked at Miller, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, he looked back at me. "A compromise. No safe house for now. But my agents are inside and outside your residence around the clock. Panic buttons. Armed escorts for Julian and Leo. And you give us full, unrestricted access to every document in this room. We digitize everything tonight." "Done," I said. "There's one more thing," Miller said, her tone shifting to something more clinical, more terrifying. Something Eleanor was terrified of. She had a meeting scheduled with us for March 21st, the day after she died. She told us she was finally ready to name the central figure, the person at the heart of the network. She wouldn't say the name over the phone. She said it was the one person who could destroy your life just by speaking your real name. My throat tightened, my heart hammering against my ribs. "My real name? What are you talking about?" "I'm Arthur Sterling. I've been Arthur Sterling for 40 years. Miller looked at Vance. The marshal reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a manila folder, the edges frayed. He slid a single, grainy black and white photograph across the desk. It was a picture of a young man, barely 25, with dark, haunted eyes and a jagged, angry scar along his hairline. He was sitting in what looked like a cold, concrete police interrogation room. "That's me," I whispered, my fingers instinctively tracing the faded scar on my forehead, a mark I'd always been told came from a childhood fall I couldn't quite remember. "No, Mr. Sterling," Vance said quietly, his voice filled with a strange kind of reverence. "That is Thomas Moreland, born in Richmond, Virginia, 1959. I felt the room tilt. The walls seemed to vibrate. My entire history, the memories of my parents, my childhood, my very name began to dissolve like sugar in water. "You are the sole survivor of the 1984 Moreland arson," Vance continued. Your parents, David and Martha Moreland, were murdered when their home was firebombed in the middle of the night. You were the only witness. You testified against a high-ranking member of the Richmond mob, but the case was sabotaged from the inside by a corrupt prosecutor named Lawrence Vance, no relation, and a detective named Raymond Cook. They didn't just kill the case. They tried to kill you. I don't remember Richmond. I stammered, the words feeling like they belonged to someone else. I've lived in Asheville my whole life. My parents, they died in a car crash when I was 10. I remember the funeral. Those are the memories that were given to you. Thomas, Agent Miller explained gently, her voice finally showing a hint of empathy. You were placed in the Witness Security Program WITSEC in January 1985. Because the threat was so high and the corruption so deep, you underwent a then experimental form of narrative immersion. You were given a new history, a new family background, and intensive psychological conditioning to help you bury the trauma of the fire so you wouldn't accidentally blow your cover. Arthur Sterling is a ghost, Vance said, a persona created by the Department of Justice 40 years ago to keep Thomas Moreland alive. And for 40 years, it worked. It worked perfectly, until Eleanor found out. I looked at my sons. Julian was staring at me, as if I were a stranger he had just met on the street. Leo looked like he wanted to punch the wall, his face a mask of confusion and betrayal. So our grandfather wasn't a clockmaker in Ohio? Leo asked, his voice trembling with a child's vulnerability. Our whole family tree is a government fabrication. Everything we know about where we came from is a lie. The people who murdered your parents, I whispered, ignoring Leo's question as a sudden, visceral flash of physical heat flickered in the back of my mind. The smell of smoke seemed to fill my nostrils. The ones who burned that house. Are they still out there? The triggerman died in prison, Miller said. But the man who ordered it, the man who paid the prosecutor to bury your testimony and make a 25-year-old witness disappear, he's very much alive. He spent 40 years climbing the ladder of power, and he's never forgotten you. I looked at the filing cabinets. I realized now why Eleanor had been collecting files on judges, mayors, and senators. She wasn't just a blackmailer. She was a guardian. She had been tracking the survivors of the conspiracy that murdered my parents, keeping them on a short, tight leash so they wouldn't finish the job they started in 1984. She had traded her soul to keep mine intact. I need to see the rest of the tapes, I said, my voice cold and hard, the voice of Thomas Moreland. We'll have them moved to your house under armed guard, Vance agreed. But Mr. Sterling, Thomas, be careful. Those memories were buried for a reason. Digging them up isn't just a recovery of the past. It's like opening a tomb that was never meant to be disturbed. I looked at the photograph of the young Thomas Moreland. I didn't know him, not yet, but I could feel his fear, and beneath it, a dormant spark of the rage that had been suppressed for 4 decades. My wife died for these secrets, I said, standing up with a strength I hadn't felt in years. I think it's time I find out who I actually am. The air in my home office that evening was thick with a tension that felt almost combustible, a heavy, static charge that made the hair on my arms stand up. Federal agents were stationed at every entrance of the property, their dark, silent silhouettes visible through the thin gaps in the heavy velvet curtains. They moved with a predatory grace, ghosts in tactical gear haunting the edges of my life. Inside, the room felt smaller than ever. My sons, Julian and Leo, sat on the leather sofa, looking like 2 men who had just survived a high-altitude plane crash only to find themselves lost in a trackless, frozen wilderness. They were staring at me, but I knew they were seeing a stranger, a man whose very name was a government-issued mask. In the center of the mahogany desk sat the second tape. It felt heavier than the first, a black plastic brick containing the shattered pieces of my reality. It was a relic of a life I hadn't been allowed to remember. Marshal Vance stood by the door, his arms crossed over his broad chest, watching me with a look of professional pity that I found increasingly hard to stomach. Mr. Sterling, or should I say, Thomas, Vance began softly, his voice barely rising above the hum of the air conditioner. Recovering suppressed memories isn't like watching a movie in a theater. It's not a passive experience. It's like waking up in a room that's already on fire. The brain buries these things to protect the heart from stopping. Are you absolutely sure you're ready to let the smoke back in? I've lived 66 years as a man who doesn't exist, Elias. I replied, my hand hovering over the VCR, my fingers trembling with a mixture of dread and a desperate, starving hunger for the truth. I don't think I have the luxury of a choice anymore. The man I was is banging on the door, and I have to let him in. I slid the tape labeled Tape 2, the mission, into the player. The machine groaned as it took the cassette, a mechanical whirring that sounded like a countdown. The screen flickered with snowy static. The tracking hummed for an agonizing 5 seconds, and then Eleanor appeared. She looked younger here, perhaps 10 or 12 years younger than the woman in the first tape. Her hair was darker, lacking the silver streaks of her final years, and her eyes held a spark of defiant, dangerous energy rather than the weary resignation I had seen earlier. She was sitting in the hidden room, the fluorescent lights reflecting in her pupils. The date stamp in the bottom corner read, July 14th, 2015. Arthur, she began, and even the way she said my name, the name that was a lie, the name that wasn't mine, felt like a protective, warm embrace from beyond the veil. If you're watching this, it means the inevitable has happened. It means you've already encountered the marshals. It means the walls I built to keep the world out have finally crumbled into dust. She leaned into the camera, her face filling the screen until I could see the fine lines of determination around her mouth. I discovered the truth about you 3 years into our marriage. I found a hidden compartment in your old travel trunk, the one you brought from the relocation center. Inside were documents from the Department of Justice, a relocation manifest, and a psychological profile of a man named Thomas Moreland. At first, I was terrified. I thought I was married to a criminal, a man hiding a dark, violent past. But then I used my father's old connections to read the grand jury transcripts from Richmond. Eleanor's expression turned grim, her lips thinning into a hard, white line. I realized then that you weren't a criminal, Arthur. You were a victim who had been silenced by a system that was too broken and too corrupt to protect a 25-year-old boy. I saw the names of the men who murdered your parents in that fire, and I saw the names of the men who allowed them to walk free. And then I looked at the news. I realized those same men were still in power. They were the rising stars of Virginia politics, the titans of industry, the men shaking hands at charity galas. She stood up and paced the small, windowless room, her hands moving with a restless, jagged energy. I knew that as long as those men existed, as long as they held the levers of power, Arthur Sterling would never truly be safe. WITSEC is a cage, Arthur. It relies on you being small. It relies on you being invisible and forgotten. I didn't want you to be invisible. I wanted you to be free. I wanted you to be able to look at your own face in a mirror and know who you were. So, I started the mission. Leo leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the screen with an intensity that matched his mother's. The mission, he whispered, the words sounding like a prayer. She called it a mission. I began to track them. Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength. One by one, I used the money from my family inheritance to hire private investigators who didn't ask questions. I bought bank records from hackers in Eastern Europe. I planted bugs in the offices of men who thought they were gods. I found their weaknesses, the bribes they took to grease the wheels of industry, the sordid affairs they hid from their voters, the laws they broke every single day to maintain their status. I didn't want their money, not at first. I wanted leverage. I wanted to make sure that if they ever thought about looking for the ghost of Thomas Moreland, the cost of finding him will be the total destruction of their entire world. She stopped pacing and looked directly into the lens, her gaze so piercing I felt I had to look away. But I realized that fear is a temporary fix. People with that much power eventually stop being afraid. They get arrogant. They start to believe their own lies. I needed a way to protect you forever. I needed to build a case that would not just scare them, but incinerate them. Every person in those filing cabinets is a thread in a vast, ugly tapestry. And that tapestry leads back to one man. She paused, and for a moment, the only sound in my office was the mechanical whirring of the tape and the heavy, synchronized breathing of my sons. The central figure, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural whisper. The man who ordered the fire in 1984. He is the one who has been hunting you for 40 years, even when you didn't know you were being hunted. He wants you dead because you're the only living person who can connect him to the murders of David and Martha Moreland. He thinks you've forgotten. He thinks the government erased your value as a witness. But I've kept the evidence alive. I've kept the fire burning. Who is it, Mom? Just say the name. Julian shouted at the screen, his polished legal composure finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. As if answering him from across the years, Eleanor slowly shook her head. I cannot say his name on this recording. Not yet. If this tape were intercepted, it would be a death warrant for everyone in our family. I've hidden the final piece of the puzzle, the insurance policy, in a place only you would remember, Arthur. Somewhere we made promises that the world couldn't break. Somewhere the air smelled like pine and the world felt like it was beginning again. The screen dissolved into a harsh, hissing static. I sat in the heavy silence, my mind racing through 40 years of memories, tearing through the mental files of our life together. I was searching for a place that matched her description. Somewhere we made promises. Somewhere that smelled like pine. Dad, Leo said, his voice trembling as he reached out a hand. Do you remember? Did we ever go to a cabin? Did you ever live in a house with pine trees? I closed my eyes, and for the first time, I didn't push back against the darkness. I didn't reach for the comfort of the Arthur Sterling narrative. I let the cold, gray fog roll in, and then a light broke through. Pine needles. The scent was sharp, cold, and clean. I felt a small, delicate hand in mine, Eleanor's hand before the rings, before the children. We were standing on a high, rocky ridge. The Blue Ridge Mountains were stretching out before us like an unrolled bolt of blue velvet, disappearing into a purple horizon. I was young. I was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit I'd bought for our elopement. I was terrified of a future I couldn't see, but Eleanor, she was glowing. She looked at me with a love that felt like a shield. The overlook, I whispered, my eyes snapping open. Mile marker 364 on the Blue Ridge Parkway. It's where I proposed. It's where we stood in the wind and promised to never have secrets from each other, no matter what the government told us to do. Vance's face went a ghostly shade of pale. The accident site. Eleanor's car went over the embankment at mile marker 364. She didn't die there by accident, I said, a cold, hard clarity settling over me like a shroud. She was going to the hiding spot. She was going to get the final evidence, the insurance policy, to give to you, and they caught her. They knew where she was going. If they caught her there, Miller said, her voice sharp with a sudden, frantic urgency, it means they might still be searching the area. They might not have found what she hid yet. We need to get to that overlook. Now. But as we stood to leave, the front door chimes echoed through the house. It was a cheerful, melodic sound, a three-note greeting that felt like a sickening mockery of the horror unfolding in the office. Vance tapped his earpiece, his posture going rigid. Team 1, report. Who's at the front door? There was a crackle of static, then a voice came through the comms. It's Mrs. Sterling, sir. Julian's wife, Angela. She's got the kids. She's hysterical. She says she's not staying at her house another minute with men with guns pacing on her lawn. She demanded to be let in. Julian moved toward the door, his fatherly instincts overriding everything else, but I caught his arm, my grip like iron. My wife's voice from the first tape echoed in my head, a warning from the grave, especially your daughters-in-law. Julian, wait, I said, my voice low and warning. Dad, it's Angela. She's panicked. She's got Olivia and Caleb in the car in the middle of the night. He pulled away with a desperate strength and ran toward the foyer. I followed him, my heart hammering against my ribs. We reached the front door just as Julian threw it open. Angela stood there on the porch, her face tear-streaked and flushed, clutching the hands of my 2 grandchildren. Behind her, the high-beam headlights of her minivan cut through the mountain darkness like searchlights. Julian, thank God, she sobbed, rushing into his arms and burying her face in his neck. There are people watching our house. Men in black SUVs parked at the end of the street. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to call. So I just drove here. I watched her closely. I looked past the tears and the trembling. She looked terrified, yes. But there was a flicker of something else in her eyes as she glanced around the foyer. A calculated, sharp look at the federal agents standing guard. It was the look of someone counting the exits. "It's okay, Angela." Julian soothed her, stroking her hair. "You're safe here. The marshals are protecting us." "The marshals?" Angela asked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Her gaze shifted to me, cold and probing. "Arthur, what is going on? Why are there government agents in our living room with rifles? What did Eleanor do?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed again in my pocket. Another text from the unknown number. I pulled it out. "The circle is closing, Thomas. One more chance to be smart. Give us the ledger and the location of the policy, or you'll watch those children burn just like your parents did 40 years ago." I looked at Angela, then at the two innocent, sleepy children standing in my foyer. Then I looked at the dark staircase leading up to Eleanor's hidden room. "Vance," I said, my voice sounding like grinding stones, "take my sons and Angela into the kitchen. Close the blinds. Secure the perimeter. I need to check one final thing in the office before we leave for the parkway." "Arthur, you shouldn't be alone right now," Vance said, his hand on his holster. "Just give me 5 minutes." I barked, the authority of Thomas Moreland bleeding through. I retreated back into the office and shut the heavy oak door. I didn't go to the filing cabinets. I went to the VCR, which was still holding the second tape. I hit rewind, then play. I watched the final 10 seconds again, searching for the clue I had missed, especially your daughters-in-law. I realized then that Eleanor wasn't just warning me that they might be victims. She was warning me that they were the vulnerability. They were the soft tissue the central figure would use to cut us open. I grabbed a heavy tactical flashlight from the desk drawer and went into the hidden room. I didn't look at the files. I went to the back of the chamber, to the pivot hinge Marcus the contractor had mentioned. There, etched into the cold steel of the mechanism with a diamond-tipped pen, were 4 numbers I recognized instantly. Not a date, not a year, but a map coordinate for the overlook. I heard a soft, metallic click behind me. I turned around slowly. Angela was standing in the doorway of the hidden room. The tears were gone. Her face was a mask of cold, sharp lines, lit by the red emergency light of the hub. In her hand, she held a small, sleek, silenced pistol aimed directly at my heart. "I told them I needed to use the restroom to wash the kids' faces," she said, her voice devoid of the warmth I had known for 15 years. "But I knew you'd come back here, Arthur. You always were the sentimental type. You couldn't leave without one last look at her ghost." "Angela." I whispered, the name feeling like ash in my mouth. "What are you doing? Think about Julian. Think about the kids." "I'm saving my family," she snapped, her voice cracking with a frantic, desperate ambition. "The people Eleanor was tracking, they're very powerful, Arthur. They're the ones who run this state. They offered us a way out, a way to keep the money, to keep the house, to keep the life we've built. All we had to do was tell them when you finally found a room." I asked, my blood running cold. "Julian doesn't know," she spat, her lip curling in contempt. "He's too weak, too much like you, always playing by the rules of a game that was rigged before he was born. But I'm a mother, Arthur. I won't let my children's lives be destroyed because of a 40-year-old fire and a father-in-law who doesn't even know his own name." She stepped into the room, the gun never wavering. "Where's the ledger? And where did she hide the insurance policy? Tell me now, or I'll start with the boy in the kitchen." I looked at the daughter-in-law I had loved like my own flesh and blood. I realized that Eleanor had been right all along. The enemy wasn't just at the gates. They were inside the house, holding the hands of my grandchildren. "You're not going to kill me, Angela," I said, taking a step toward her. "Because if you do, you'll never find what Eleanor hid. And the people you're working for, they don't reward failures. They bury them." Outside, the wind began to howl through the Appalachian pines, a low, mournful sound, and I knew that the fire was coming back. But this time, I wasn't a boy hiding under the stairs. This time, I was the one holding the match. The silence in the hidden room was so absolute, I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock in the hallway outside. Angela stood 3 feet from me, the sleek barrel of the silenced pistol steady in her hand. This was the woman who had brought me soup when I had the flu, the woman who had tucked my grandchildren into bed with stories of kindness and courage. Now, her eyes were twin voids of cold ambition. "The ledger, Arthur," Angela repeated, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "I know it's in one of these cabinets. Tell me which one, and I can make sure Julian and the kids are kept out of this. If you fight me, the people outside won't be as polite as I am." "The people outside are United States Marshals, Angela," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. "You can't walk out of here with a gun and a ledger and expect to disappear." "The Marshals?" She laughed, a brittle, sharp sound. "You think the federal government is a monolith? The man who ordered your parents' death has his hands in every pocket from Richmond to D.C. Half of the security detail on your lawn is on his payroll. Why do you think I was able to drive right up to the door?" The horror of her words sank in. I looked at the security monitors on the wall. Outside, the figures in dark suits were moving, but they weren't standing guard. They were repositioning, closing the circle. Eleanor knew. I whispered. She knew the corruption wasn't just in the files. She knew it was in the air we breathe. Eleanor was a fool, Angela snapped. She thought she could control monsters with paper and ink. You don't control monsters, Arthur. You feed them until they're full, and then you pray they leave you alone. Now, for the last time, where is the insurance policy? I looked at the coordinate etched into the pivot hinge. I looked at my wife's chair. And then I did something I haven't done since I was a 25-year-old man named Thomas Moreland. I stopped being afraid. "It's not here," I said. "And you're right about one thing. Eleanor couldn't control the monsters, but she knew how to trap them." I reached for the collection of Emily Dickinson poems on the shelf, the lever that opened the door. But instead of pulling it toward me, I pushed it deep into the recess of the shelving unit. There was a heavy, mechanical clunk from beneath the floorboards. The lights in the hidden room flickered and turned a deep, warning red. "What did you do?" Angela shrieked, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Eleanor built this room to protect me," I said. "And she built a failsafe to destroy the evidence if it ever fell into the wrong hands. In 60 seconds, a high-temperature incendiary device in the floor will ignite. Every file, every ledger, and every person in this room will be reduced to ash." "You're lying." "Am I?" I stepped toward her, ignoring the gun. "Look at the monitors, Angela." On the screens, the federal agents outside were suddenly scrambling. A silent alarm had gone off on their tablets. Marshal Vance was shouting into his radio, his face a mask of panic. "Give me the gun, Angela," I said. "Give it to me, and we walk out of here. We take the kids, and we run. Not to a safe house, but to the only place where the truth still exists." For a second, I saw the mother in her battle with the conspirator. Her hand trembled. The red light cast a hellish glow over her features. She looked at the filing cabinets, the $15 million she thought she could secure, and then at me. She lowered the weapon. I grabbed her arm and pulled her out of the room just as the first wisp of chemical smoke began to curl from the floorboards. We burst into the hallway, where Julian was standing with the children, his face a mask of confusion. "Dad? Angela? What's happening? Get in the car." I yelled. "Vance, get everyone out of the house. Now." We didn't wait for the explosion. We piled into my SUV Julian, Leo, the children, and a silent, shivering Angela. I took the wheel, my old muscles screaming with a phantom memory of adrenaline. I tore down the driveway, past the confused agents, and onto the winding darkness of the Blue Ridge Parkway. "Where are we going?" Leo shouted from the back. "To the beginning," I said. The drive to mile marker 364 was a blur of black asphalt and towering pines. The scent Eleanor had described, the sharp, cold sting of pine, filled the cabin of the car as we climbed higher into the mountains. In the rearview mirror, I could see the orange glow of my house on the horizon. Eleanor's archives were burning. 25 years of leverage, gone in a pillar of fire. We reached the overlook just as the moon broke through the clouds. The mountains looked like sleeping giants in the silver light. I killed the engine and stepped out into the cold air. "Stay in the car," I commanded my sons. I walked to the edge of the stone wall, to the exact spot where I had knelt 40 years ago and asked a beautiful woman to spend her life with a man who didn't know his own name. I looked down at the base of the wall, where a small, weather-beaten stone sat nestled among the roots of an ancient pine. I knelt and pushed the stone aside. Beneath, it was a small, waterproof pelican case. I opened it. Inside was a single digital drive and a handwritten note for the man I loved and the man he was meant to be. Finish it. I felt a presence behind me. I didn't turn around. You found it, a voice said. It wasn't Vance. It wasn't my son's. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 40 years, yet I recognized it in the marrow of my bones. I turned slowly. Standing there, silhouetted against the headlights of a second car that had followed us in silence, was a man in an expensive wool coat. He was elderly, his hair a shock of white, his face etched with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no. Lawrence Brennan, I said, the name tasting like poison. The former prosecutor, the former mayor, the central figure. The man who had presided over the death of Thomas Moreland's parents. You have a remarkable memory, Thomas, Brennan said, his voice smooth and cultured. Even after all the conditioning the government put you through, I suppose some fires never truly go out. You killed my wife, I said, my hand tightening around the digital drive. Your wife was an extraordinary nuisance, Brennan sighed, stepping closer. She spent 2 decades hovering over my shoulder like a shadow. She thought she was protecting you, but all she did was prolong the inevitable. She was coming here to meet Agent Miller, who, I should mention, has been on my payroll since she graduated from the academy. Eleanor was going to hand over the one thing I couldn't allow to exist. This, I held up a drive. The original grand jury testimony from 1984, Brennan said. The version my father and I thought we had destroyed. It contains your identification of the men who set the fire, but more importantly, it contains the recorded confession of the detective who helped us do it. With that drive, the statute of limitations on the murder of David and Martha Moreland becomes irrelevant. It's a RICO predicate that would dismantle my entire family's legacy. He held out a hand. Give it to me, Thomas. Do it for your grandchildren. Angela was smart enough to see the way the wind was blowing. Are you? I looked back at the car. I saw Julian and Leo watching through the glass, their faces filled with a dawning realization of the scale of the evil standing before me. I looked at Angela, who was staring at the floorboards in shame. And then I looked at the dark woods surrounding the overlook. You're right, Lawrence, I said. Some fires never go out. But you forgot one thing about Eleanor. She never went anywhere without a backup. I pressed a button on the side of the pelican case. From the darkness of the trees, a dozen tactical lights snapped on, blinding Brennan. Federal agents. Drop the weapon. Marshal Vance stepped out from behind a thicket of pine, his sidearm leveled at Brennan's chest. Behind him were 30 men in tactical gear, their insignia gleaming in the moonlight. Brennan froze, his face contorting in shock. Vance? What is this? We had an agreement. The agreement was with the man you thought I was, Vance said, his voice cold as the mountain air. But I've been working with Eleanor for longer than you've been paying me. She knew you had moles in the FBI. She knew you'd follow Arthur here. This wasn't just a hiding spot, Lawrence. It was a sting. I stood up, my legs steady. I walked over to Brennan and looked him in the eye. My name is Thomas Moreland. I said, each syllable of victory. And you're under arrest for the murder of my parents and my wife. As the agents moved in to zip-tie Brennan, the world seemed to grow quiet. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for 40 years, the fog, the confusion, the suppressed grief finally began to lift. I sat on the porch of a small, quiet house on the coast of South Carolina. The Asheville estate was gone, lost to the fire Eleanor had set to protect us. The money in the trust had been seized and redistributed to the victims of the people Eleanor had blackmailed, as she had requested in her final will. Julian and Angela were in counseling. He had chosen to forgive her for her moment of weakness, realizing she had been a pawn in a game far larger than any of us. Leo had finally found a sense of purpose, working with Vance to track down the remaining members of Brennan's network. And Clara? Clara had been found in a safe house in Maine. She hadn't stolen the money. She had moved it on Eleanor's orders to keep it out of Brennan's reach, acting as a final decoy. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was the one Vance had shown me, the young Thomas Moreland. Beside it, I placed a photo of Eleanor, laughing at a summer barbecue. I finally remembered the night of the fire. I remembered the way my mother had pushed me toward the basement door. I remembered the heat. But more than that, I remembered the promise Eleanor and I had made at the Overlook. No secrets, she had said. She had kept her word in her own way. She had kept the secrets of the world away from me, so I could live a life of peace. Now, the peace was real. It wasn't a construct of the government or a side effect of psychological conditioning. It was earned. I sat on the porch of a small, quiet house on the coast of South Carolina. The Asheville estate was gone, lost to the fire Eleanor had set to protect us. The money in the trust had been seized and redistributed to the victims of the people Eleanor had blackmailed, as she had requested in her final will. Julian and Angela were in counseling. He had chosen to forgive her for her moment of weakness, realizing she had been a pawn in a game far larger than any of us. Leo had finally found a sense of purpose, working with Vance to track down the remaining members of Brennan's network. And Clara? Clara had been found in a safe house in Maine. She hadn't stolen the money. She had moved it on Eleanor's orders to keep it out of Brennan's reach, acting as a final decoy. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was the one Vance had shown me, the young Thomas Moreland. Beside it, I placed a photo of Eleanor, laughing at a summer barbecue. I finally remembered the night of the fire. I remembered the way my mother had pushed me toward the basement door. I remembered the heat. But more than that, I remembered the promise Eleanor and I had made at the Overlook. No secrets, she had said. She had kept her word in her own way. She had kept the secrets of the world away from me, so I could live a life of peace. Now, the peace was real. It wasn't a construct of the government or a side effect of psychological conditioning. It was earned. I looked out at the ocean, the waves rolling in with a steady, rhythmic pulse. For the first time in 66 years, I knew exactly who I was. I was a son who had seen justice. I was a father who had saved his children. And I was the husband of a woman who had fought the world to keep me safe. The silence of the house no longer felt suffocating. It felt like a clean slate. The fire was out, and the morning was finally here.